The Detroit Lions 2025 offseason is effectively over. While there's still time to make some roster adjustments, still time to sign some veterans they have missed on in the NFL draft, their offseason is essentially over. Their 90-man roster is constructed, their coaching staff is put together, their free agency and their draft is essentially done with. And we know what this team is going to go into the 2025 preseason with. And with that being said, with the offseason essentially being done and over with, let's grade the offseason. Let's talk about how good they did from the day they stepped off the field after their defeat in the divisional round versus the Washington Commanders, and talk about whether or not this year they are a more competent Super Bowl competitor than they were in years prior. So with that being said, we're going to go over the coaching staff, the free agency, the signings, the draftees, the undrafted rookie free agents, and all the different parts of the offseason. And at the end, come to a conclusion of whether or not the Detroit Lions are a better football team. So let's start off with the coaching staff. And there was a lot of changes this year. Immediately after the Detroit Lions loss in the divisional round, things began to change. Within 48 hours, Ben Johnson was a Chicago Bear. Within 72 hours, Aaron Glenn was a New York Jet. And from there, many coaches began to follow. Tyrell Williams went to the Patriots to be a defensive coordinator. You had all these different coaches like Antoine Randall L getting promoted to assistant head coach with other franchises. And the Lions lost a lot of talent throughout the early stages of their NFL offseason. Arguably, they had more room to climb than any NFL team in the entirety of the league from a coaching staff perspective. After losing so much talent, they had more room to grow than anyone else. And I think they did a fantastic job. About every single hire they made was maybe not an upgrade, but at least a lateral move. Starting off, of course, with John Morton, the brand new offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions, had a lot of gripe from people early on because you look at his time with the New York Jets, you look at the way that he left things with the New York Jets, and you say, okay, that one's a little bit questionable, right? He had some personality conflicts. He had some issues there. And all those things are certainly a concern and something to keep an eye on. When you look at those players' career in a bubble and you say, okay, look at their career with John Morton and you look at their career without him, almost all of their career highs come from that one season that John Morton was their offensive coordinator, whether it be the quarterback's passing statistics, the running back's rushing statistics, the wide receiver's ability to get down the field, separate, and create yardage. All of those players had career highs under John Morton or very nearly close to it. Kelvin Shepard, I thought, was a phenomenal hire. A player that joined the Detroit Lions in 2021 as the outside linebackers coach, was promoted in 2022 to the all-around linebackers coach, as well as invoicing as the defensive coordinator at the Senior Bowl when the Lions went down to Mobile, Alabama. And now, 2 years removed from that, he has officially been promoted to the defensive coordinator role. He grew and learned under Aaron Glenn, and I would expect a very similar system, priding themselves on press, physical, man coverage, blitzing, and big hits and physicality at the line of scrimmage. I would expect a strong run game. I would expect a lot of really similar things. And I wouldn't expect the defense to look a whole lot different than it has in years past from a schematic standpoint. But of course, getting a lot more talent back from a season ago will make them look good and better than they were. Last season, through the first 5 weeks, they were one of the best defenses in football, and even with all the injuries that they suffered, they finished as one of the best defenses in football. They were a phenomenal team from a talent perspective, and getting all that talent back is only going to make them more profitable and better on the defensive side of the ball statistically. You take a look at some of the other coaches that stuck around. Scotty Montgomery made a transition from running backs coach to wide receivers coach. After being an offensive coordinator and a wide receivers coach at the collegiate level, he is more than qualified and capable of doing so, and it allowed the Detroit Lions to bring in a guy like Tashard Choice, who has a lot of connections to Jahmyr Gibbs. He recruited Jahmyr Gibbs out of high school to go to Georgia Tech and then transferred, or I guess changed jobs, to go over to the Texas Longhorns roster, where he put guys like Bijan Robinson, Roschon Johnson, and all the other running backs over the last 3 to 4 seasons in the NFL from the University of Texas. He has created a pipeline from that university to the NFL. His connection with Jahmyr Gibbs, I think, helps the Lions out a lot. I think he's going to be good for David Montgomery. I think he's going to be excellent for Jahmyr Gibbs. And I think he'll even rub off on some of the younger guys like Sione Vaki, like Craig Reynolds. And I do think it will be a better running back room than even it was a season ago, as impressive as it may have been. David Shaw was brought in as the pass game coordinator, longtime head coach of the Stanford Cardinal, led them to numerous top 5 finishes in the AP poll, led them to several Rose Bowl victories and BCS Bowls before officially leaving the role 2 seasons ago. His tenure at Stanford didn't end in the way that he would want it. Stanford as a program is a little bit towards the lower part of college football at this point, but a lot of that had to do with off the field stuff. A lot of that had to do with Stanford being an Ivy League school, making recruiting significantly harder, just making his job more difficult than it possibly could be. I think his coaching on the field was always really good. His pass game and the ability to throw the ball down the field at Stanford was really, really strong. And this is a guy that coached Stanford all the way back with guys like Andrew Luck. He coached them through the Christian McCaffrey era. He has put a lot of good players in the NFL and put a lot of good passing concepts into the NFL. And I think he'll be a great option to add to the Detroit Lions staff. Hank Fraley got a promotion for the offensive lines coach and run game coordinator. We all know how good he is. And then Casey Rogers being brought over from the defensive line coach and being granted the run game coordinator for the defensive side of the ball. He's a player that has helped develop guys like Vaitai, Kalijah Cansey, and so many other really good edge rushers and defensive linemen in Tampa Bay that are now really, really strong contributors to that defensive line. And I think he'll come over and do the exact same thing for Detroit. I don't think Detroit missed on a single coaching staff hire this year. I don't think they missed on a single coaching change this season. They may have lost a little bit at the offensive coordinator spot, but I think they got better at defensive coordinator. I think they got better at wide receivers coach. They got better at running backs coach. They got better with the pass game coordinator. They got better with the run game coordinators. Maybe not better on the defensive line, but somebody very comparable into what they've done for the NFL in recent memory. They did really good. I'm not sure they could have hired a much better staff to put the puzzle back together than what they actually did in reality. So for that, I give the coaching staff an A+. I think they did a phenomenal job, and I think the Lions are set up for success for a very long time with this staff. Moving on to free agency, this is where things begin to get a bit controversial. The Lions began their offseason by cutting veteran Zadarius Smith, freeing up $11 million in cap space. They made some larger signings like DJ Reed and Derek Barnes at the beginning of the year. DJ Reed getting a 3-year contract for $48 million, and Derek Barnes getting a 3-year contract for $25.5 million. After that, they re-signed a lot of players that were already on the roster. Levi Onwuzurike, a 1-year contract for $5.5 million. Marcus Davenport, a 1-year deal up to $4.7 million. Roy Lopez from the outside was brought in for 1 year, $4.65. Tim Patrick for 1 year, $3 million. And then a lot of role players, right? Guys like Grant Stewart, Anthony Pittman, Dan Skipper, Ezekiel Turner, Miles Adams, Craig Reynolds, Trevor Nowaske, Kyle Allen, Kenny Yabode, Shane Zylstra, Al-Qadim Muhammad, Rock Ya-Sin, Avonte Maddox, and Kayode Awashia are all players that were brought back. And while none of those guys are going to be Pro Bowl talents, none of those guys are going to make the Detroit Lions better at the top end for their ceiling, they make the Detroit Lions floor as a roster, if things go absolutely off the wall horrible, that much better than what they would have been. And I think this was a good free agency period. They got better at cornerback and did a really good job at doing so, but they also got a lot of value out of their pass rush, and they got a lot of value out of their free agency, right? I think a lot of the strategy going into free agency was kind of stay under the radar, do a lot of smaller deals, fill a lot of the needs in the depth. I think they got a lot of value out of that. I think they were quite successful in doing so. And while doing so, they got a starting cornerback. They retained a majority of their contributors from 2024. They added a lot of depth behind their new starting cornerback. They improved the linebacking depth, and they got a lot of defensive playmakers to return to this roster, and it allowed them to do something very unique. And the Detroit Lions free agency, as unimpressive or unflashy as it may have been, allowed them to do something really interesting in the NFL draft, that of course being go into it with no glaring needs. Yes, they could address the offensive guard after losing Kevin Zeitler. Yes, they could address the defensive end position after losing Zadarius Smith. But even if they didn't do either of those things, both of those positions, for at least the time being, were pretty much taken care of in free agency and allowed them to focus on best player available, building up this roster as good as it could be, and putting the best players in a position to succeed. And that's exactly what they did. They went into the offseason and into the NFL draft and selected Tyleik Williams, the interior defensive lineman from Ohio State, Tate Ratledge, the guard from Georgia, Isaac Tesla, wide receiver from Arkansas, Miles Frazier, the guard from LSU, Ahmad Hassanin, the edge rusher and defensive end from Boise State, Dan Jackson and Dominic Lovett, 2 special team contributors at safety, and even an undrafted rookie free agency. Guys like Caden Prescorn, Jackson Meeks, and Jacoby Keeney James are guys to keep an eye on throughout the preseason that the Lions didn't necessarily need, but added because they were value and added because they could potentially make the roster and fight and scratch and claw their way into a position in the NFL. Taken away from the NFL draft, they improved the defensive line. They got 2 good wide receivers. They got 2 really good offensive guard talents. They've got 2 great contributors on special teams. They got quite a bit of value out of an NFL draft that saw them picking at the 28th overall spot. I think there's a pathway for each and every one of those players to eventually not only make the roster for Detroit, but eventually contribute. I think Tate Ratledge and Mikael Williams will impact the game right away. I think Isaac Tesla may be a few years away, just the same as Ahmed Hassanin and Miles Frazier, but I think those guys could potentially impact the game in years 2, 3, or even 4, and potentially be cheaper options down the road to allow the Lions to keep a lot of their star players at home. Guys like Jack Campbell, Brian Branch, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs, and all the guys with their contracts coming up. These are the players that are going to allow the Lions to keep those guys around. And I think they did a really good job of getting a lot of those players that they can sub in and make sure that they can contribute at some point throughout their NFL career. So with that being said, I thought overall the Lions offseason was incredibly positive. I thought there was a lot of good things to take away from this roster. And overall, I think the Lions roster as of today, as of May 2nd, 2025, is better than the roster that left the field at the end of the playoff run, right? It was better than that team that lost to the Washington Commanders, not only because they're healthier, but on paper, I do think they are a better football team 1-to-1 and pound for pound. So grading each position individually, we already talked about the coaching staff hires. I thought it was an absolutely A+. They hit on every single hire and got better just about everywhere. Free agency, I gave it a solid B. I think they got better with 1 key starter and lots of depth. They went into the draft with 0 needs for the NFL draft, which allowed them to go BPA, but obviously could have made larger splashes. Guys like Josh Sweat, potential trades were always on the block, but you can't really hurt the Lions for not signing some of those players because those guys were expensive and those guys may have wanted to go other places schematically. They may have wanted to go other places just emotionally, and the Lions may not have even been to their top choice, which means they would have had to overpay for a lot of those free agents. They did a good job for the players that they had, and that's how I choose to grade the free agency based on what players signed. And what players signed were a new starting cornerback and a lot of depth on the defensive side of the ball that really hurt the Lions a season ago when they were lacking that. And then the NFL draft. They went in, they got a lot of BPAs, they got a lot of good football players, they got a couple immediate contributors and a couple longer-term contributors, and I gave it a B+. Was it the flashiest draft? Absolutely not. Would it be an A if Mike Green, didn't have the off-the-field issues and was selected at 60? 100%. But with the talent that they did get, with the starters that they did get immediately, and the players that they brought in, they got better as a football team. And that's the biggest takeaway you can have for a team. Did they get better, right? The Lions are going from a 15-2 number 1 seeded NFC powerhouse and got better this offseason. That is a good thing. That is something that often gets overlooked because they didn't trade for Trey Hendrickson, because they didn't trade for Myles Garrett, because they didn't make a big splash in free agency outside of DJ Reed. That often gets overlooked. It wasn't an A+ offseason, but it didn't need to be an A+ offseason. The Lions were already one of the top 5 rosters in football. They were already one of the top 3 teams in football when completely healthy. They still are that. And not only that, but they got better at that position, even if they are still not the number 1 best roster in football. They are a great football team. They got better this offseason, and you should be excited for how much they are going to improve from 2024 to 2025. So with that being said, that is all I got for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below your opinions on the offseason. What do you grade the coaching staff hires? What do you grade the free agency? What do you grade the drafts order and the NFL 2025 draft? I'd love to hear you guys' opinions, but with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please go down below and do so. It helps the channel out a ton. But that being said, thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.